We all know that the right habits and mindsets can be transformational in how we live our lives. But among the sea of advice online, it can be challenging to know who to trust with these important life decisions. At The Standard, we answer those questions and introduce you to some of the most successful people in the world in their fields and the habits and the mindsets they use to achieve their success. To learn more about our social platform, head on over to www.thestandardapp.com. And now, your host, myself, Chris Palatroni. Welcome to another episode of The Standard. I am your host, Chris Palatroni, and today's guest is Celest Pereira. She is out of the UK. This is a physiotherapist, a yoga teacher, an author, a podcast host, and much more. I've known Celeste for about a year and a half. When I first reached out to her in building The Standard, she was super kind and contributed a number of videos on her habits that contribute to her mental health and well-being. And so I was really excited to spend some time with her today and really just get to know her better. And in this particular episode, she does not disappoint. You will quickly learn that she is, as she likes to describe, an anatomy geek, a neuroscience expert, anything about biomechanics. And yes, she does love yoga as well. It quickly unravels in the first part of the conversation where we just go deep into neuroscience. So you're going to want to hear a little bit about that. And then we move our way into her best habit and her best mindset, which, we sort of oscillate in and out between the things that she does and a little bit of the neuroscience behind it and the practicality for other people as well. And so daily movement, as well as I love the concept of letting go. We talk about the emotional spectrum and a lot of different books that we're recommending to each other on this right here. So this is one of those episodes that I think you're really going to enjoy. She has an infectious personality, a great smile, and just a loving, warm human being. And I think that comes off really well on this episode. So without further ado, I want to welcome Celeste. Well, I'm so excited to talk to you. I know you and I have been connected for maybe about a year and a half now, but I've never had, other than the videos you shared on The Standard, really had the opportunity to dive into your background a little bit and also the habits and mindsets that really help you cultivate success and sustainability and mental health. So I'm so curious to where you're going to take this. But before we do that, I feel like I've stalked you enough and I have a really good understanding of your background. But I would love you to maybe take a couple minutes and just help us understand a little bit of who Celeste is and then dive a little bit into your professional background because you do so much. I mean, I know you don't always describe yourself as an author, but you got a podcast, you're an author, you're yoga. I mean, I won't divulge it all, but you got a lot going on. So I'd love you to share with the audience, who is Celeste?
Ooh, that's such a big
I
question.
know, right?
Yeah, so it was so funny because normally with these, I'll just fill your listeners in on a quick
Yeah.
thing that's going on in the back of my mind. So normally with podcasts, guys, we first get onto the call, we have a little chat, and the person goes, "I'm going to hit record now." And as Chris is talking, I'm like, "Oh, we're going. Here we go."
Hey, this is just a conversation, Celeste. This isn't. We're not
I love
grilling you or anything. You're just sharing a little bit of your life with us. That's it.
it. Okay, so you want to know a bit more about me? I guess it's so. Where do I begin? So I am a little bit jack of all trades, master of none. I feel that way anyway at the moment because I am a physio. I do have online client base that I work with, particularly people who have sustained um, some type of head trauma, which
Mm,
often is labeled as not very severe, but their life falls apart. They have to move back in with their parents, or they are struggling to do basic things. They can't hold down a job. And it turns out that that quote unquote not very serious head trauma was very traumatic and actually has impacted their brain enough that they can't function in society. And so that's where I come in. I can start rehabbing people. So that's part of what I do. But I'm also a very passionate educator. So I also run training courses, particularly for the yoga community, actually, teaching them about yoga, biomechanics of the body, and also neuroscience. Because currently, on the side of all of that, I am specializing in neuroscience, I'm starting to specialize how to look at the brain, how the brain functions, and how we can maximize its potential to help people if you've got something like a head trauma, as I've explained, or you're just an athlete and you want to improve your performance. So I've got this wide spectrum of things. And then on the side, I also teach yoga. And amongst all of that stuff, passions are like kite surfing, rock climbing, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Explain a little bit. I actually had to look it up. What is a physio? Like what does that really entail?
So I think in America, where I'm assuming a lot of your audience is based, it would be referred to as a physical therapist.
Okay.
And so traditionally, what we used to do is look at someone's joints and their muscles. And if they have pain or they're trying to improve function, we would help to optimize those systems.
Mhm.
But the reason why I've decided to specialize more in functional neurology is because really those systems are under the control of the brain. And in fact, every system is under the control of the brain. So if we can learn a bit more about the brain, we actually do find that works so much better for people.
So where did this I guess I'll call it like a passion or maybe curiosity of neuroscience. Where did that come from? I don't always see yoga and neuroscience paired together. And I think you'll agree I see a lot of people that have had maybe sustained some sort of injury, and then yoga was the way in which they moved through that, and then they became a practitioner. But where did the passion for neuroscience come from for you?
Well, when I studied to be a physiotherapist at university, we a third of our degree was neurology.
Okay.
And then many years later, I was actually at the rock climbing wall, and someone who's actually one of the top CrossFit trainers in the world was also there. And he was doing a bunch of really weird stuff. And I was like, what are you doing? Is that a vestibular drill? He was basically doing these weird head movements. And he was like, yes, yes, it is. Do you know these? And I was like, vaguely, I remember studying them at uni, and it was part of my degree that I was the most fascinated in. And he was like, yeah, I'm specializing with this company called Z Health Performance. And I immediately looked them up and I bought almost all of their courses. And I'm so glad I did, because I've studied with lots of different places, including a degree. And I have to say that their education system is probably the highest that I've come across to date. So if anyone out there is listening to this and you guys are curious about learning more about the human body or learning more about neurology, I really recommend Z Health Performance to take your education further.
Is there any particular book when it comes to neuroscience that you would recommend somebody reading?
I think a great starting point is a book called The Brain That Changes Itself.
Okay.
And that book in story format lists out lots and lots and lots of stories. I want to say hundreds, but that's probably excessive. I remember listening to it because I'm better at listening than reading. And I remember listening to it, just being fascinated by how many stories the author shared of people who started out with something that they really struggled with. And then by developing their brain, they were able to do it because, and I'll just give you a little bit of background to that. Even when I was at university, we were taught that you only have a set number of neurons. And whilst they do reorganize themselves, once they start dying away, they never come back. And then it was so amazing that we started to discover that neurogenesis is a part of this conversation. So
Mhm.
we are generating new neurons. It just, that old thing of if you don't use it, you lose it is a massive piece of the conversation. And in addition to that, your brain requires stress to form those new neurons and to reorganize the current neurons. So we do have to actually put ourselves in quite a high level of demand for that to happen. And the reason I'm so passionate about that, particularly for the yoga community, is because a lot of people do the same practice over and over and over again, the same poses, the same
Mhm.
way, the same order. But when you start learning about the brain, you do initially, when you first start, improve, which is why you refer to people with injuries moving through their injuries using yoga, because initially your brain is thickening and forming new synapses. But unfortunately, a lot of those injuries do come back for the yoga community. And the reason is once your brain has become used to a certain level of threshold, it actually then plateaus. And after a little while, will then start to regress. It's a organ that requires high levels of challenge for it to continually thicken and for it to continually develop. So when I started learning this, I was like, oh my God, the yoga community really needs this. And actually, I'll just throw in the gym community really needs this as well, because, oh my goodness, linear patterns. You've got the bar positioned in the exact same way and your feet pointing perfectly in the exact same way every time. It's
Mm.
just not how your body evolved. And the example that I've given many times on the training courses that I teach is, if you were out in nature, think about the variety of inputs your
Mm.
body would be experiencing. The inputs of in your feet on rocky surfaces, sandy surfaces, muddy surfaces, leafy surfaces. Your eyes would be looking around for danger. Your whole body would be contorting in lots of different shapes, continually surveying
Yeah.
your environment. And what we do is we stare forwards at a fixed length at our computer screens or our TV screens. When we walk down the street, there's no real danger around us, so we forwards. And our feet are in the same sensory inputs because they're in their shoes, and they're in the same shape because they don't even come out of the shoes until they get home, and then they're on a flat surface at home. And I'm just giving those two examples of many
Yeah.
to illustrate the fact that we just are living incredibly bland lives. And if we analyze the brains, if we analyze data, we know that the brains of hunter gatherers were actually far thicker and far more developed than the brains of our modern society, simply because we had to remember so many different types of food or living strategies or survival strategies just so that we could make it through the day.
Is there, I'll put you on the spot with this, and I didn't go to school for neuroscience, but I do have such a curiosity with it. So I think I've read maybe like 5 or 6 books, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, Rewire the Brain, and I don't know, there's so much that I've taken away from it. But for all that you know about neuroscience, is there like a stat or two or a concept or two that really stands out to you as like, I don't want to say shocking, but just so interesting about the brain? Is there anything that like really pops out?
Yeah, there is actually. And I'm so glad you asked this question. So, before I give you the study that I want to refer to, I'll first explain that traditionally we've always looked at a concept such as pain as being related to the body part in question. My knee hurts. There must be a problem with my knee. But when we start to look at pain neuroscience, we realize that this is completely inaccurate. And our thinking as scientists first began to become curious about this by looking at the amputees community, because
Mm.
although they had lost their limb, they could still feel their limb and they very much had a lot of pain. And Dr. Ramachandran created this incredible device called the mirror box therapy, where they would put the intact limb
Mhm.
into a box where there was a mirror, and then it would look like they had two hands or two legs, and they could unfurl the hand and the pain drastically improved. This got scientists thinking, well, maybe pain is not in the body part in question. And they actually discovered there's no pain receptors in your body. What we have are nociceptors. And what nociceptors relay is threat information. And your brain then decides if the threatening information coming in is worthy of producing an output of pain,
Mm.
because pain is not an input, pain is an output, and the brain chooses pain to modulate your behavior. So if it thinks I can't keep my humans safe by running, I'll give them knee pain to make them walk, because when they walk, they're actually safer. So then
Mm.
all of us go around thinking, oh no, I can't run because these old knees can't take it. But it's more because the brain follows three steps. One, it takes in information. Second, it interprets that information. And then thirdly, it chooses the appropriate output.
Mm.
And if the information coming in is not very clear, and if it can't interpret that information, it's likely that it's not going to choose the most empowering output, but rather it would choose a safety output. And under that bracket comes nausea, dizziness, fatigue, pain, all those things, weakness, stiffness, all those going to slow you down and keep you safe. So, this is all a preface to share this amazing study. They took a really huge sample size of around 3,600 people. It was massive. And what they did is they ensured that every single subject in the sample was pain free. And what they did was they scanned their backs to find out if any of the people in this pain free sample had degenerative changes of their back. And fascinating, they found that every single age bracket from their 20s all the way through to their 70s already displayed degenerative changes in their spine. Facet joint syndrome, spondylosis, herniated discs. It was all there. Less so in the 20s, but it was there. Much higher in the 70s, but not a single person had pain.
Hmm.
So, what that does is it kind of brings into question this narrative that we've all been given that, oh, I went to the doctor and I had a scan and it turns out I have a herniated disc and that's why I've got back pain. Because it's just not true. There are a lot of people with horrible, horrible things happening in their body and they don't have any pain. And
Hmm.
then you've got these people that actually have got nothing wrong with them. And we actually have created a name for them. There's like people have fibromyalgia.
Mhm.
And they've got this fancy name. It sounds like there's something really wrong with them, but there isn't. It's literally just pain, chronic pain. That's the term they use. And so I wanted to share that with your audience because another really fascinating study took groups of people and they gave them traditional physical therapy, like I used to practice. They
Yeah.
gave another group analgesics, pain medication. And the final group, they gave them pain education. And every single time, pain education came out top for relieving people's pain. So I wanted to share that because I think that when you start learning about the brain, you realize that actually there's so much more to it, and the experiences that you're going through, if you know a little bit more about how the brain functions, it can actually improve your quality of life.
I love that. I actually remember reading about the study on the amputees, and I think they've got a lot of really good videos out there too that demonstrate like how the brain like imagines that there's a limb there even if there's not a limb there. One that stood out to me, and I'll try not to make this whole episode about neuroscience, but I could totally go there with you. Do you remember selective attention? There's do you remember that one?
No, go
So
on.
yeah, so and this is just like an example of like how when the human focuses on something, we narrow our tunnel of vision and we get hyper focused on a particular aspect of something, and everything else in our view becomes blurry or obsolete. And so they did this phenomenal study. I mean, I was just mind blown. So anybody listen to this, you totally got to do this. Probably not for yourself, but for somebody else. Is they had a number of kids. I want to say like 5 or 6 kids in a circle, and half of them are wearing white shirts and half of them are wearing black shirts, and they're tossing a basketball around, and they're saying, and they tell you the going into it is like, pay attention to how many times the ball is passed. And so the kids are passing the ball and you're sort of counting it, and in the middle of this video, like while they're passing the ball, somebody in a gorilla costume walks straight through the middle of the
And
screen.
they don't see it.
Straight through the middle. I mean, you can't miss it. Right in the middle of the screen. And if you've seen this for the first time, but you don't have the context of the gorilla costume, at the very end of the video, they're like, "Did you see the gorilla walking through?" And
I
everybody's
know
like,
so many people go, no.
what are you
I know.
talking
I
about,
have seen
gorilla?"
this. I have
And
seen
and
this.
then I did this to my wife, and she's looked at me like, "You're a lunatic. What are you talking about?" And then, they rewind it, and there's the gorilla, like, "How did you miss
Yeah.
this?" And it just what I took away from that, and it's just one example, is how, like, our brain will literally miss reality in a lot of ways. Like, it focuses
Mm.
on very specific things, and so, I don't know, I just have this, just thought in the back of my mind is, like, what I perceive, and you even said it a little bit with taking in information, and then you sort of filter the information through assumptions and biases, and then, there's so much coming at us, but what we perceive as reality, we're just getting a tiny little glimpse of what's actually out there, and I find that just mind-boggling that there's all this stuff happening, and maybe we're getting part of it right, maybe we're not, I don't know. So
I know, that is so true. It is fascinating. I did see that study and I really, really loved it. I thought it was just incredible because you're so right. It is crazy how it's what magicians use. That's
Mhm.
basically how they trick us into producing quote unquote magic when actually it's just about directing your focus.
Let me ask you one more question on this, going back to the example that you brought. I get that there's so much power in understanding some of the knowledge and the ways that our brain is wired. Like, I recognize that. And I would always argue that you should take the time to learn a little bit about these different facets so that you can, incorporate them in your life. However, that's one thing to know it, but I gotta imagine you deal with people that are like, I'm dealing with pain. No, Celeste, this is real pain. Like, I'm like, and there's like almost like a cognitive dissonance as to, yeah, I hear you, but like that doesn't match like what I believe is my reality. And so I got to imagine like in part of the work that you're doing, you're not just treating the physical body, but you're treating the mind as well. It feels like that's got to be so hard to like try to rewire the way that people have been trained to think about themselves. Would you say that the rewiring of their brain is harder than the rewiring of their like physical body? Like, what's that like for you when you're working with somebody? Because you're doing this remote as well, right? Like most of your practices is done remote. Well, tell me a little bit about that.
So I can never change someone's mind if they don't believe in something and they don't want to do something. I'm not going to spend time trying to convince people. But one thing that I do employ in my sessions, which is hard to deny, is something called a test retest. And it's very simply someone will have something they want to get better at. It could be reducing pain levels, it could be touching their toes, it could be running faster or catching a ball more efficiently. So these are all, again, outputs. I would then apply some kind of intervention, whether that be a vision drill, a vestibular drill, a mobility drill, and I will then retest what they want to get better at. And if they've improved in such a short space of time, it's very hard for them to turn around and go, "Oh, I don't agree
Mm,
with what you're doing," or "I don't see the value in that." But an additional layer to what you're talking about is understanding that when you come from this place of truly recognizing, and I'm going to go really esoteric now, so please bear with me. I promise I'm a scientist at heart, but when you recognize how actually you are this truly magnificent, I want to use the word divine, but I don't want to also put people off. But I'll give you an example. I have a client who sustained a rear impact road traffic accident and had severe whiplash off the back of that. And classic story, I deal with these people all the time. Her life started falling apart. She had to quit her job, move back in with her parents. And we started doing sessions and we were getting there. We were getting some progress. But when things really started to turn around was when I got her to, as she was doing the intervention, like the vision drill or the cerebellar drill, whatever it might be, while she was doing the drill, she had to internally, quietly in her own mind, have this internal dialogue of, I am safe. My body's doing exactly what it's supposed to, even though it's not comfortable. Thank you for keeping me safe, brain. I love you, body. Like these kind of positive words, which, some people just roll their eyes when they listen to them and they're like, I can't just lie to myself. I can't look at myself in the
yeah.
mirror and go, hey, beautiful. And I agree. You never want to lie to yourself. And often when I start doing these things with my clients, they do become quite emotional, particularly if I'm saying things like your body's doing exactly what it's supposed to keep you safe. They get very emotional because so much of their life has been destroyed by the way their body is reacting to basic things like going outside
Mhm.
or walking or taking a shower. They're finding very simple things very hard. So for me to start encouraging them to remind themselves, your body is doing so well. It's keeping you alive right now. There's a lot of emotion attached to that. But once they move through that emotion and they start using this tool, the drills work a lot faster and a
Yeah.
lot quicker. And we start to see the progression in these people. And it's so encouraging and
Yeah.
fascinating. And this is what keeps them going. So yeah, two phases of the answer there, and one more sciencey, and the other a little more esoteric. And the important thing is to stay true to yourself and choose the one that obviously resonates with you.
Yeah, it sounds like as they remove some of the resistance, they start to reap some of the gain. I couldn't help but think there was like 2 concepts. It's like there's a famous quote is like, "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right." And it becomes very self-fulfilling. It's like, "Who am I to tell you?" I mean, you know, right? And then the other one, and I've thought it a couple times as you've talked, you mentioned the idea of like, "Oh, your knees hurt. I'm a runner, so I'm constantly battling." I'm like, "No, it's just because 'cause I'm getting older doesn't mean I can't run. Like, I'll keep doing it." And it's the idea of subscribing to a program. And so, like, I think a lot about this is to like, whether I'm like, I don't know, a little under the weather and am I sick or maybe the way that I should act as I get older when it comes to running. I'm like, no, 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 I can't subscribe to that type of program because I feel like as soon as you subscribe to a program, whatever the program may be, you will just live out the program. If you don't think you can run in your 40s, chances are, to your point, you're going to have achy knees and your back's going to hurt, and like, I don't know, whatever, you're going to feel lethargic, and like you literally won't be able to run. So I think there's some element there. All right. So we'll pivot from the neuroscience stuff, but I can totally keep going with you. So maybe we'll do that in a future one here. So much of the spirit behind this particular podcast, Celeste, is really taking a deep dive at what you believe your best habit is and what you believe your best mindset is. And so I know, as a yoga professional and a teacher, there's a lot of good habits that you have. So we're going to try to constrain that down to what you believe your best one is at this moment. So what do you feel at this stage in your life is a habit that contributes the most to your mental health, your well-being, and your overall success? What would you say?
I mean, it's a challenging question to answer because I suppose as a human being, a we are culmination. Is that the right word? We're like a little puzzle of so many different pieces. And sometimes it's the entire puzzle that kind of helps
Mhm.
move us in a direction. But I guess the very first thing that did pop up into my mind was making sure that I move every day is a
Mm.
big one for me. I'm not saying that it's always happening. Sometimes I have a day where there's so many work commitments or family commitments or whatever it is that unfortunately I have to let the ball drop on that. But I can definitely feel a significant shift in my mental health when I don't move. And I particularly, I'm not going to ever say that I had depression. I realize that that is a very strong self diagnosis, but I had a glimpse of it during lockdown
Mm.
because I was working really, really long hours. I think it was very fear based. I think I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get through this if I don't work every hour of every day. I think everyone went to their default
Yeah.
addiction. Mine was work. Um, and we weren't really allowed to leave the house much. So I don't think I was getting as much natural light. And of course, being a part of a community, I think. And these are basics, right? These are things that everyone listening has probably heard so many times, like move enough, get outside, be part of a community. But for the first time in a very real and tangible way, during COVID, I actually experienced what removing those elements out of my daily routine would produce inside me. And it was a feeling of utter despair and
Mm.
hopelessness. And I felt, yeah, it's such a weird thing. I just remember having this like brave front whenever I had to deal with anyone or anything. But inside I just kept thinking, what's the point? And that's not like me at all. I'm the most bubbly, like energetic person. I'm always so positive. But that deep underlying feeling was not there when those elements were removed. So moving enough, getting outside and making sure that I'm surrounded by others, whether they're close people or just acquaintances, doesn't matter. Just being a part of something where there's other humans, for me was really powerful. When those things came back, it was like a 180.
Yeah. There's a couple different directions we're going to go on this, but I do want to maybe lean into like the effect that it had on you, just because you highlighted that. How long into the lockdown and the removement of your movement, how long did it take before you started to, I guess, experience despair and the why bother? Like, I mean, was that instantaneously? Did that culminate over the course of 6 months? I mean, I don't know what it was like out where you were at. You guys weren't allowed to leave your home at all, or what was the circumstances in London, right?
We were really, really lucky in London because we were allowed to go for walks around the park.
Okay.
So that was okay. We were allowed to, but it's a funny thing because you couldn't go very far because you wouldn't have a loo or there wouldn't be anything to do. So sometimes we did go on really long walks, but we'd have to get back home. And again, my default, my fear-based mentality at the time was you need to work hard. And boy, oh boy, I just put in so many screen time hours. Just fe- I recognize now that I'm a bit older and wiser that it was fear-based strategy, but at the time I felt like that was the only strategy. And how long it took for me to really realize how this felt is such a good question. I guess the timelines in my mind, if I'm really honest, are quite blurry. I remember being so I would say big-headed. When I first went into lockdown, I was like, "I'm gonna leave lockdown better than I went in." That was like my slogan. And now I'm like, "Yeah, you left so much worse." Like,
Oh, no.
I put on weight, and not that putting on weight is a bad thing, but I lost so much function. Like, there were so
Yeah.
many things I could do in my yoga practice that I couldn't do when lockdown ended. And I felt that my fitness had declined dramatically and my mental health had suffered. And all I had to show for it really was that I'd worked hard. So it was just such an amazing lesson in life to just my partner always says this to me. And when your partner says something, you kind of listen with one ear and not really with the other. But he always talks about this age old thing that I'm sure every single person listening has heard of the cogs of the wheel, that work is just one cog. You have to make sure that all the other cogs are turning for you to function as a human. And he's so good at like maintaining all the cogs. He loved lockdown. He thought it was the best thing ever. And here I was slowly withering away because, like I said, I just came from this fear-based mentality that if I didn't work really, really hard, I was going to fail somehow and that was going to have repercussions. I will say that even through those struggles, though, I am benefiting now from that time in so many ways. Like I've shifted my business online, and that has been really lucrative for me. And all the work that I put in there, I'm still profiteering off that work. So
Yeah.
I look back and I actually have to be kind to my younger self. And I have to remind myself now that I just did the best I could with what I had. And if anything, we just came through that stronger. But if I had to go through that experience again, I probably would deal with it very differently.
I'm so curious, and not to make light of the way that you went through that, but with you being an expert at neuroscience, I can't help but like ask myself the question of like, in hindsight, could you not have reframed the situation so that you didn't have these negative impacts on your mental health and your well-being? Like, I do recognize like movement and like we'll get into like the positive benefits of being outside around people, but I'm thinking like, well, I mean, could you just not have got a Peloton? I mean, could you? I mean, you got to go walk outside, like you got to see your partner. Like, I guess what I'm saying is like, in hindsight, could there have been a way that you could have reframed it that it would have had a more positive impact on you? Like, would that have been possible or?
Well, that's why I shared what I shared. Like, I went into lockdown going, I'm gonna leave lockdown better than I went in.
Yeah,
Like, that was my way of reframing the situation. I was like, "I've got more time now. I have all these resources at my disposal, like social media that we can
yeah,
tap into, and we've got these amazing computers that open up the world to us." So, there was definitely the intention of that. But I just wanna also say that having gone through that experience, it gave me a great compassion for mental health,
yeah,
actually, as a umbrella term. Because so often you hear of people going through these things and you're like, oh, why didn't you just do blah de blah? And it's so funny because I actually hired a personal trainer and I worked out with him every single morning at 7 a.m. I was outside,
yeah.
even when it was pouring with rain, every single morning. I actually woke up on Christmas Day and he came,
Oh,
and
wow.
Christmas Day, I was training with him. But it wasn't enough. It didn't substitute
Yeah,
living life like I normally live. In London, when we going out and about, you walk a lot, and I wasn't obviously getting those same amounts of steps in.
mm,
And it was purely based off the fact that when I was doing these different online seminars that I was running, I was putting so much energy into all of them because I felt like if I didn't work that hard, the workshops and these seminars that I was running online wouldn't be good. So it was funny how I was dealing with two parts of my personality. One that, yes, you're right. I was doing the reframing and I understood the basics of how to get through a day with a positive mindset. But that didn't counteract the fact that my shadow side, again, I'm going a bit esoterico here, but probably that side that I hadn't fully acknowledged was just deeply rooted in the fact that I didn't trust myself. There was probably a huge imposter syndrome. And the fear that was associated with that was far, far stronger than any kind of positive mental pep talk that I was ever going to engage with.
yeah, that makes sense. Let's flip over to the positive side of it. So, like, when you said daily movement as your number one habit, like, what does movement look like for you? I mean, you've mentioned walking. Clearly, you are a yoga teacher. You mentioned working out, and then I think as we started this podcast, you do kite surfing, and you do rock climbing. So what does movement like? Walk us through like how often, for how long, what type of movements, like what checks that box for you?
So, one of the things that I have brought with me from lockdown, one of my little lessons is to just do your best every day and to
Mm,
make sure you move every day. So, whilst I haven't got like a really strict schedule where this happens on this date at every single time for this long, what I am making sure I do is I move every day for at least 2 hours, and I
mm,
make sure I get 10,000 steps in every single day. That's like baseline. But what happens in those 2 hours varies. So sometimes that'll involve doing some neuro drills and doing a yoga class. Sometimes that means going climbing. Sometimes that means doing some mobility drills just on my floor, just taking some time to move around, or just being out in nature and hanging off a tree. Like it does vary dramatically. But the baseline that I've just laid out to you, that's kind of whatever happens in that time is great. As long as I make sure that those two boxes are ticked. I've moved for 2 hours and I've done 10,000 steps, then you can go home and put your feet up.
there's a few things that, at least from, you've shared a few videos on the standard, and I want to touch on. I'm like, it sounds like there are some other key elements to your daily movement, like sunlight seems like a big one. You mentioned the idea of seeing more people other than just your partner. So that seemed like a critical box to check. And then you've also mentioned like nature, and you brought it up a little bit when we were talking about neuroscience, of just like how novel nature is, and it forces you to just sort of expand the mind a little bit because nature is so creative. I guess when you're thinking of your daily movement, are you thinking of those things as well, as to like, maybe not in all of your daily movement practices, but just in general, of like, I do need to get some sunlight. I do need to get out. Maybe it's fresh air. Maybe you want to see water. Like, are those elements that you're trying to weave into your daily practices, or are those just a natural byproduct of you're moving so much, they're just going to get in there?
I mean, when we were going through the lockdowns and I had shifted my entire life online, I'd had to be more of a conscious decision. Okay, it's daytime now. I need to get outside. I need to like weave in that time. But now that the life is open again,
Yeah.
I teach at a yoga studio twice a week, but I use that space to work. So whether it's Monday or Friday, I will get up and walk. I have to walk 30 minutes to the station and 30 minutes back. So that's
Yeah.
like an hour of walking. When you're in London just to get lunch, that's going to be another 5,000 steps because there's so much walking in London. That's just how the city is set up. Um, so I don't have to think about it so much
Yeah.
anymore. And I think that for me, that's another thing that I should mention actually to your listeners is set your life up so that you don't have to think so hard. Because as soon as you have to
Uh,
remind yourself to do something, now willpower comes into the equation, and our brains are wired for familiarity, for safety, for comfort. You're gonna convince yourself not to do it. It's just the easiest way. So I make sure that I schedule in the classes that are happening at the yoga studio, which, by the way, is a movement studio. They've also got calisthenics there, which I've also started doing.
yeah.
So it's so great because you can be like, right, 8 o'clock, I've got my calisthenics class. So I've got to leave the house at 7. That means I have to wake up at 6. Like, there's no question about it. Then I've got a 30-minute walk woven into that morning commute. I don't have to think about it. It's just what happens.
Yeah.
And that, oh my gosh, it's a game changer.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you this final question on this, and then we'll pivot over to mindset. You mentioned some of the negative components of not getting this movement in, and without trying to read into it, like what are all the positive benefits that you get from hitting 10,000 steps, from moving your body, from doing all these things that you've described? Like, is it just a perkier, more energetic Celeste? Like, what, like how does doing those things like impact your life outside of the daily movement? Like, what does that look like?
I've mentioned mental health. I can also add into that just being more efficient, ideas, creativity,
Mm,
and actually seeing the wood for the trees, like not getting so bogged down by the little details, not being so overwhelmed by small things that are really don't matter. As soon as I give myself those elements, I'm like, oh, this is just a minor. It's just easier to cope with life. It's funny to say it in those terms and it sounds overly simplistic, but sometimes when you haven't been outside and you've been staring at your screen for ages and I don't know, the delivery is late. So you freak out about these small, tiny, inconsequential details which don't matter. And if it's there's a brilliant book that I highly recommend called The Chimp Paradox. And this is a book that is so good because he talks about the brain in really simple terms. And it's
Mhm.
all about training your chimp, right? Making sure that your chimp is fed and that it's watered and that it's exercised because your chimp is far stronger than the human part of your brain. So if you don't exercise your chimp and you don't get it out there and you don't give it the basics, it's going to freak out and it's going to be so much stronger than the human part of your brain that's like, dude, this is not a big deal. Like, we need to calm down. There's no calming down the chimp once it's out the cage and once it's freaking out.
Yeah, that's a good book. And for those people that haven't read it, I'll ask you, what is the chimp?
So the chimp is your old brain. It's like your reptile brain. It's the part of you that is far stronger than you could ever realize. It's in charge of most of your life in the sense that it's keeping you alive moment to moment with your organs, but also it's governing your non reasoning part of you. So this is what kind of flares its ugly head when your partner walks in late and suddenly you just lose yourself. I wanted to say lose your shit, but I didn't know if that was okay.
Totally fine. All right, I do want to ask you one more question on this, and maybe less from your personal perspective, but this is going to be, I think this is episode 29, and I've interviewed people all over the world. So, I'm always looking for coaches, whether they're yoga or fitness or nutritionists or habit coaches and whatnot. And there is absolutely a theme that I see that if I'm talking to somebody who's in fitness, daily movement, I would say 9 out of 10 times is their core habit. And so I'm curious, like, and I ask myself, I'm like, well, is that just because that's what they do for a living? Like, I mean, of course it like, but everybody says like it is daily movement. And so maybe from more of like less Celeste and more neuroscience expert, like why do you think that is? Like, why do you think like all the people that make a career off of movement in some way, shape, or form, why do you think their top habit is daily movement?
Because everything is movement. Everything. Everyone thinks that you have a brain to perceive the world. Dr. Daniel Wolpott said it so eloquently in his TED talk. He's also a neuroscientist, where he said, we think we have a brain to perceive the world, but we have a brain for one reason and one reason only, and that is to produce adaptable and complex movements. And I shared this on my Instagram, and a girl wrote to me. She goes, "Nah, what about Stephen Hawkins? He wrote books and he couldn't move." And I was
Mhm.
like, "Yeah, but how did he write those books? He had to use his eyes and he had to move them around. Otherwise, there is nothing. There's nothingness without movement." And there's this brilliant little animal that lives in the ocean. It's called the sea squirt. And it floats around while it's trying to find its perfect habitat. And once it finds the perfect rock, it embeds itself into the rock and then it eats its own brain. Because once it doesn't require movement anymore, you don't need a brain. Brains are extraordinarily energy hungry organs. So that's why when you don't use a task for a while, the brain lets those neurons die off and it reorganizes to have a smaller brain. Because why would you have a big, thick brain and use up all that energy? It's a waste. That's why we have to keep challenging our brains at very high levels to keep those neurons thick and strong. And all of your body requires movement. The nerves, they are using movements to send impulses. Your blood vessels are using little micro contractions to push the blood through your veins. And every time you have a concept in your mind, like you've got an idea, this is all coming through the process of movement, hormones being excreted, neuron synapsing. It's all happening because of movement. Movement's everything. So
Yeah.
if we can't move, there's nothing.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. It's like if I don't go for a run, or if I'm not walking around, or if I'm not at the gym, I will become a grumpy, mean person after too long. All right, let's pivot over to mindset. So in a similar fashion, like And I recognize, Celeste, that there's a lot of powerful mindsets that you have. I totally get that. So we'll constrain this once again to what you believe right now is like the mindset that really supports your mental health, your well-being, your success. Is there one particular mindset that sort of stands above the rest at this stage of your life?
Absolutely. I'm so grateful that you're asking me this question. It's the concept of letting go.
Ooh.
Just let it go because all that you think you are is really a construct. As we've spoken about this briefly before, but you've been told so many things about yourself and what you believe in, and some of those you latched onto out of choice, and some of those you don't even realize have been so ingrained into you since you were little. And it's hard to let go of that because it's formed a part of your identity.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying to let go of your identity or to let go of all of those ideas, but very often we encounter challenge. And sometimes that flares up emotion inside us. Let's say you're watching the news and there is a world event taking place which you don't agree with, that you think something wrong or evil has happened there, and it flares up a lot of emotion inside of you. One of the best things that you can do to help the world is elevate your internal state, because your internal state affects the world around you more than you could ever realize. So, the first and most important thing is to learn how to let go of those negative emotions. And once you've let go of them, recognize that through that letting go process, that's what opens the doorway to courage, acceptance, reason, and beyond that, love, joy, and peace.
I love this one. You are the second guest that has ever mentioned "Let It Go," and I remember Jeff, who was on a couple episodes ago. I love this one. I actually have this as a quote on my wall. I think, maybe like 4 years ago, I tried to distill my life down to like I love quotes. I tried to distill it down to like a certain subset of quotes, and I'm like, I'll always lean on these quotes when things get hard, and letting go is one of them. There's a great book by David Hawkings, "Let It Go: The Pathway to Surrender." I actually had to read that twice. It was a hard read, but it was a really good one. So, like, help me understand for you personally, like, why did you say this particular mindset for you?
I listen to that book all the time,
Oh, do you?
like
Okay.
every week. I just put it on when I'm walking to the station. Yeah, I think it's, let's put it this way. If you listen to it and there are things in it that you don't agree with, I'm with you. There are certain things I'm like, it's a bit much. I think to distill it down into just simple words, it's never that simple. And an example that I'll give is sometimes intrinsically in your heart, you know something is wrong, and he'll say something like, there is no good or bad. Now, I understand that on a spiritual level, there are things that work and things that don't work. That's almost a better way of phrasing it. But if I know that, for example, a child has been taken advantage of, let's use that as an example. I know intrinsically that that is wrong, and I don't subscribe to it. I would never support someone who did something like that. So I don't say I agree with everything in this book, but there are certain things about it that are just brilliant reminders. And I've come to the point now, I've listened to it so many times that I just will go through the day and I'll just go, what else can I let go of? And it's so weird because this has helped me in so many different areas of my life. The other day, I woke up and I was cold sweats in excruciating pain. And the first thing I did is went to the loo because I just thought if I sit on the toilet, maybe something like some demon will come out of me and then I'll be better. And as I sat there, I thought, let's practice letting go. Let's see what happens. And I just did that. I just thought, whatever this feeling is, I accept it. It's actually here because it's supposed to help me. So I accept it. And all the negative emotions that I have attached to this feeling, I'm going to let those go. I'm going to accept that this feeling, however uncomfortable and awful it is needed to expel this random thing that's inside me. It was crazy. Within 20 minutes, it was like nothing had ever happened. The cold sweats had disappeared, the pain was gone. I was like, I couldn't believe it. Normally, I'm very hypermobile, and with the hypermobility comes a lot of weird stuff in your body. And I was always very unwell, always had weird stuff going on that was inexplicable. and it would last a long time. And now, since I've been practicing this letting go concept, it's weird how quickly I move through things just by letting go of the negative emotions associated to that. But another example is I have to teach sometimes big groups of people, and every time I teach, I get extremely nervous. Like, I think I'm going to throw up. I get so nervous. And this time I was like, okay, let's practice letting go before you get on stage. And I was the funniest I'd ever been. I was cracking jokes. People were laughing. I was like, oh, this is great. And I say that is unusual for me because I'm not very quick-witted. Sometimes it takes me a long time to come up with the right response at the right time. And on stage, I was throwing out all these jokes and everybody was laughing. And I was like, who is this person that's teaching this class? Like, this is not me. So that was just two examples. But because it's been such a positive part of my life, I just every few hours, I'm like, what else can I let go of? And it's so weird how this internal feeling in your body, there's this calmness. You're like, oh yeah, I was probably holding on to something that I wasn't even consciously aware of. And now that I've let that go, I just feel better.
Oh my God, there's so many directions I want to take this with you. So let me, and I totally agree with you. What I found so interesting about the book, and it's been a year since I've read, I should probably go back and read it, is I think they did, if I remember correctly, they did a pretty good job of explaining like the emotional spectrum of like emotions. And I believe it's like courage is like the midpoint of which when you move past courage, you're more in like forget the terminology, but you're more in like a optimistic state of mind, if you will. It actually helped me get rid of road rage. So like someone cut you off, I'm just like, I'm not carrying this with me. I'm just letting it go today.
Yes.
So I totally agree. There's so much application. I guess the question I would have for you first is, as a neuroscientist, why does it work? Like why?
I'll tell you.
Yeah, why?
You got great questions, by the way. You are so smart. Okay, so your brain doesn't care if you are thriving or just surviving. It just cares that you're safe. And you might be like, nah, I know I want to thrive in life. I work freaking hard. I wake up at 3 a.m. to thrive. I have quotes on my wall. Yes, your conscious human part of your brain, the most developed frontal lobe, of course. But your unconscious mind doesn't care if you sit and watch Netflix all day long eating potato chips or if you're out there running an Ironman. It doesn't care. It just cares that you are safe. So, the concept of letting go, when you look at the emotional spectrum, the lowest being shame, and then we creep up. I should bring it up so that I don't butcher the ladder, but basically it starts off with shame being the lowest. It goes to grief, fear, anger, pride. If I'm not mistaken, that all of those are really because your brain is in a survival state. You are trying to keep you safe. So, in that sense, have compassion for yourself if you do feel shame or guilt, or if you're feeling fear. Have compassion that actually this is your brain trying to keep you safe. But as soon as you let those go, you tell your brain, I am safe. And that is extremely powerful. And it's actually the reason why, with my post concussion syndrome clients, I've started utilizing this concept of internal dialogue. I am safe. Thank you, body. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to. You're doing great. Everything is happening at the right time. You don't need to rush. Like these little internal dialogues, as silly as they sound, I love you. I'm at peace. I'm filled with joy. These are so like, I don't know, cringy for some people. They're like, oh my God, you're not going to say I love you in the middle of your physio session. But guys, it actually does work. It's wild when you can start to see that shift in someone who was unable to take a shower, and now they can actually get up in the morning and go for a walk and go to the shops and come back. It's a big deal.
Okay, we're gonna take another detour. I promise. Like I've mapped out how we're gonna get back to this. But so you mentioned like your brain doesn't care whether you're surviving or thriving. Like it just wants to keep you safe. Like I'm aware of that, and I think it's such a struggle for me because like at the end of the day, like we measure in so many ways the wrong things in society. There's books on like capitalism of how we measure like growth and like are we growing as an economy, and like it doesn't take into consideration the well-being of an individual. And I think we all can appreciate, and there's plenty of studies that support it, that when you look at to what people regret at the later stages of their life, it's usually
Mm.
time with other people, it's did I follow my dreams, it's I wish I didn't work so hard. I mean, these are universal like things that people like put on their deathbed, if you will. And so my point is that surviving just to say I'm breathing doesn't mean that like you're living a healthy life. And so I don't know, it strikes me as odd that like our brain is wired in a way to just keep us alive, but it doesn't take into consideration like the emotional and the mental component of, but is this being like thriving? I don't know, like, I struggle with that concept because I totally agree, like, we're not wired for positive behavior. We're wired for, are we just gonna be here the next moment? And, like, I don't know, like, how do you reconcile like that? Is that just the way that we're woven, an innate quality of, like, being a human, and, like, maybe way off in the future, we're all enlightened over millennia? Like, I don't know, where do we go from there? Like,
I mean, it's a good question. Why are we the way we are? I think it's there's I don't understand it fully myself, if I'm really honest, but I do know that our environment plays such a huge role in that, because if we were living in nature, our survival would require so much more.
yeah,
But these days it doesn't. So whilst it seems like a silly thing to say, like your brain only cares about your survival and therefore that's kind of not very smart. In some ways it's extremely smart,
yeah,
because if we were in nature, that would involve a lot, and that would mean that we would be thriving. But because of our environment now, your brain's like, "Oh, there's nothing coming to get me." We haven't evolved as quickly as our environment. There's nothing coming to get me. There's enough food in the fridge. I don't need to fight for water. I might as well just chill out. That's what we do. We take that easy route because ultimately we can't be operating at 100% all the time in nature. You need to rest to have enough
yeah.
energy to run away from that predator, or to get that spider off your baby, or to make sure you have enough water. So when time for rest comes, you fully immerse yourself in those moments of rest, because when challenge comes, it's big and it's at a high cost. A lot can happen. So we just haven't evolved quickly enough to move through this.
There's an interesting book you might like if you haven't read it. It was in my quest to try to understand this concept more, and it's Spiral Dynamics by Don Beckham, and it talks about it's sort of a build off of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it just expands that to such great length. I actually think it does a pretty good job of tying in like the emotional vibration analysis, where it starts to look at like how you go from like pure survival, and it brings examples of like, if you're in a gang, you're sort of in it relates things to colors, and it sort of moves through like, okay, if you're into worshiping, you're sort of in this stage, and then the hippies were sort of in this stage, and it sort of walks you through the spectrum of, you don't get to jump around, you sort of have to move your way through this spiral. And I don't want to say the ultimate goal of it, but at the top of the spiral is enlightenment. It's the idea that like we're all connected, that we've let it all go. And I found it so interesting to see like the examples of just weaving in a little bit of neuroscience as to like there's just a natural progression to human development that takes place over very long periods of time, and you can't rush it, right? Like it seems like a long time, but in the spectrum of like our planet, 200,000 years of going from like man just started to form to like where we're at today is, there's actually a really good analogy, is like if you took all of human history and you put it into a book, and I think every page represented like 100 years, there'd be very little excitement in the first like 99 pages of the book. Like
Yeah.
everything happens like in the last page, because that's just the way it happens. So anyways, I Spiral Dynamics, it might be an interesting one for you to read. um,
Yeah, thank you.
let's
There's a toilet paper analogy.
Yeah,
They were like, if human history, if this planet's history had been written out on a roll of toilet paper, the human part of the story would cover about a slither of the final
Yeah.
square.
I find
And I thought that was really cool.
that so interesting. Let me bring back, so this concept of letting go. I don't know, I find it like sometimes I find it super easy and other times I find it really hard. I understand that like you never mentioned this, but I have to imagine there's probably elements of you that are a perfectionist, just the way you've described like your yoga and like training for stuff. Like, how do you work through the process of letting it go? Like, what's that look like for you? Is it journaling? Is it a walk in nature? Is it I know for me, for sometimes I find it helpful to look at space and to realize like how small we are. I've got a beautiful Carl Sagan quote on my wall, and it's a picture of Voyager. And we sent this little satellite off into space, and about 4.2 billion miles away from space, we turned it around and we took a photo of our neighborhood. And so this picture I have on my wall, it shows this tiny little blue dot. I mean, it's probably like maybe 2 pixels, and it's just like, and then there's this beautiful Carl Sagan quote that it's like everything is on this little dot. And for me, bringing things into the very large perspective, I guess a sense of awe in some ways is how
Mm.
I can remind myself, man, my problems are just insignificant. Like, I mean, this is like, and even if they are significant, I mean, like, dude, I'm one human on, 100 billion humans that have ever lived. Like, I'll be gone. Like, I don't know. I find that helpful to bring perspective to my problem. But for you, how do you work yourself through this, letting things go when maybe it's just, it doesn't come to you in 20 minutes? Like, what's that look like for you?
I mean, listen, what you've just described is so cool. I absolutely love it. And I guess it's a bit similar. I just often think of that thing when you're on your deathbed. You're like, will this matter when I'm there? And the answer is 99.99% of the time, no. And then it's worth letting it go. And that the process of letting it go is instead of focusing on all the thoughts, because there's so many,
Yeah.
just focus on the feeling and let the feeling go. And usually the thoughts follow.
Yeah. I think they've said, like, it's like, look at your thoughts like clouds in the sky, right?
Yeah.
Just observe them, right? Like, don't try to hang on to them. Just they'll come, they'll go. I find that helpful sometimes. Uh,
I'll just add one
yeah,
final thing is that it can be really, really powerful also to put yourself in a state. I know you mentioned state before, but when you look at the map of consciousness, peace is at the top. Underneath that is joy, and
yep,
underneath that is love.
yep.
And what I often do is I just close my eyes for a moment and I think, how would I breathe if I was totally at peace?
Mm,
Or what would I be feeling in my body if peace was really all that I felt about the situation? Or what would I be doing with my eyes right now if I was at peace? Or my facial expression?
mm.
Or my body position? And those little tiny physiological tweaks, they make a big impact on your nervous system. And before I know it, I'm just like horizontal. And I'm just thinking, wow, this is great. Like every little challenge is actually here just to make me a little bit better.
Yeah. The one other thing I'll add to that too is I find it really helpful to shift your environment. If you're, I don't know, festering over something, whatever it may be, and you're in the confines of your house, it may not be the best place for you to work through some thought. Like, I'm big on like get out into nature, anything you can do that looks at something vast. Maybe it's like from the top of a mountain, or you're looking at the ocean if you're lucky enough to be around a coastline. But anything that sort of expands the mind will also be very beneficial in terms of altering sort of the state in which you're operating from. And I find that's why I do a lot of running. I find that very helpful to work through some thoughts as well. Where yeah, we just don't always have our best ideas or come to our best conclusions when we're stuck in our home, if you will. So,
Yeah.
all right, Celeste. Final question I got for you. So we focus so much on you, but obviously you and myself included, we're part of 8 billion people on this planet. And so I know we talked about letting go of things we can't control, but let's just pretend we can't control something for a minute here. Is there a particular habit or mindset that if we could wave a wand and give every human being on our planet, is there one that really stands out to you that would nudge us in a more loving and kind direction as a species?
Hmm. It's along the same lines as letting go, and that would be to release expectation. Expectation of yourself and expectation of others, and to just remember that everyone's doing their best, including you.
That's beautiful. I like it. Where can people go to learn more about you, Celeste?
So, actually quite easy to find me online because my mother doesn't like silent vowels. So normally you'd put an E on the end of Celeste, not me. So if you put Celeste Physio or Celeste Yoga, I'm sure you'll find me on Google. It'll be so nice to connect with anyone who's out there, whether you require a physio session or you just have a question. Yeah, it'd just be so nice to meet you and to talk to you guys. So, and thank you, Chris, for creating the standard. And I feel like I want to interview you about your daily routine because you wake up at 3 a.m. You've obviously read a million books. So there must be some amazing stuff that you have to share with this community. And I hope you do a self podcast for the standard at some point, or maybe I can interview you for the standard podcast. It
Yeah.
would be really cool because I think you do more than most people realize. And that's what's basically driving this amazing project.
Awesome. Well, I would be happy to come on yours. And yeah, at one point, my wife keeps saying, she's like, you need to get an episode of you. And I was like, well, maybe we'll do
Yeah,
the
you
back
do.
half of
Please.
like, have
I
the
want
back
to
half.
listen to it.
Yeah, well, I'll need someone. You'll be a guest host that day. We'll get you in. But no, this has been wonderful. I feel like, I only say this to a handful of our guests, but I feel like in season 2, I'll need to have you come back because there's so many different directions we could have taken this. And I love the neuroscience component, and you're wicked smart about that. So really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks for sharing a little bit of your Friday afternoon with us.
It's a big pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I sincerely hope that your listeners got some value.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Standard. Before we go, click on the link in the show notes of this episode to learn more about today's guest. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody who you think would benefit from it as well.